Everybody could please find their way to their seats. We're going to go ahead and get started. Okay. All right. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Caitlin, and I am the Executive Director here at the Matheson History Museum. And we are delighted to, here in this space that is currently centered on our local music history, we are going to hear a wonderful presentation about the Beatles in Florida. As I've been telling people all week, the band, not the bugs. But before we get started, I just want to thank our sponsors. We are funded in part by Visit Gainesville, Alachua County, the State of Florida Division of Cultural Affairs, and the City of Gainesville. We are really grateful for that grant support for our exhibits and programs, but we also rely on our members and donors. So if you like what we're doing here, I encourage you to go and visit our table in the back to become a member of the museum. With your membership, there is a 20% discount on the book if you would like to buy that today, which we also have those for sale in the back. And I would like to, if you'd like to know more about the museum, we have several of our board members are here today. So if you are a current or former board member of the Matheson, if you could just raise your hand and give a little wave. Thank you all for coming out and supporting today. And now I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker. Bob Kealing is a 6-time Emmy Award-winning retired broadcast journalist and 2-time recipient of the Edward R. Murrow Award. He has co-founded 4 Florida heritage sites in honor of Jack Kerouac, the Allman Brothers Band, Leonard Skynyrd, and Graham Parsons. And this is his 5th book that he will be speaking to us today about. So without further ado, let's go ahead and welcome Bob.
Thank you very much. Hey, and while we're all clapping, would you do me a favor and put your hands together for the museum staff and what a great job they do? I'm just thrilled to be here today. This is about my 3rd time here at the Matheson. And it just has the most amazing spirit, and it's what I call the vibrations of history. And there are plenty here. And I've also spoken to at least 2 people today who saw the Beatles in 1964. And yep, there's one back there. Well, wait a minute. Why don't you guys get up here and speak, Dan? I don't mind telling you, I'm a little jealous. This book has been such an amazing journey. I was lucky to do more than 30 primary source interviews with folks who came in contact with the Beatles, had substantive encounters, were profoundly moved by them. This guy in the middle doesn't need any introduction, does he? Little Tommy Petty. That autograph up in the right corner, to my estimation, that is the very first autograph that all of the Beatles signed together here in Florida. Okay? And you're like, okay, how does he know that? Well, this was actually sent to me, emailed to me by a guy who had bought it along with the little ticket for the limo driver who picked up the Beatles at the airport in Miami. And the Beatles' name was spelled Beetles. And there's a sad part about the story, too. So he tells me, you look at these. I mean, to me, that is a gorgeous autograph of the Beatles. He sent it off to get a value on it and never got it back. So it is out there in the ether somewhere. In the bottom right is a signature you can see. That's Paul McCartney. And I was lucky enough to get access to the Hard Rock collection, which at the time, back in 2018, when I was doing the research, was in this sort of nondescript office building in Metro West in West Orlando. You'd think it might be an insurance company or something. And you go inside, and it is the most remarkable treasure trove. of different Beatles ephemera. And one of the pieces in there was a 4-page letter from Paul McCartney to their bodyguard from Miami Beach. And you're going to hear about him. But the point is, the primary sources in this story are what enabled me to write what I think is something very fresh about the Beatles. Because this book isn't just about their time in Florida, although that was amazingly eventful when you consider they spent almost 2 weeks here in 1964, more than anywhere else by far in North America. Okay, next, please. Okay, so you all think you know the Beatles, huh? Think you know them pretty well? All right, we're gonna have a little quiz here. All right. Okay, I will. Somebody's getting cocky back there. Of course, that's probably the one who saw the Beatles, you know. When I was growing up, I'm the youngest of 6 kids, and I inherited all of my sister's original Beatles vinyl, you know, Revolver, all that good stuff. And to me, there were always 2 songs that broke it for the Beatles big in America. I Want to Hold Your Hand, right? And She Loves You. Okay? So what was the song that just broke everything for the Beatles in America? Was it She Loves You? Boy, you guys are good. No. Or is it I Want to Hold Your Hand? Come, let's see some hands. Which one? Okay, so you think it's I Want to Hold Your Hand was the big song. Anybody think it's She Loves You? Okay, got a couple. All right, this is the Ed Sullivan Show, and this is the first #1 smash in America. Let's give it a shot, see if we can play it. Socks older than them in that video. Oh yeah, how many of you did see it? Man, I'm jealous again. You guys are too good. But yeah, that was an amazing thing to. It's just you cannot overestimate the effect that these appearances had on the youth of America. All right, because there were like 3 networks at the time, right? And these shows had 70 million viewers up there in the rarefied air with, I don't know, the Beverly Hillbillies. Okay. So, I mean, that's why these shows, you know, these appearances were so important. Next, please. Okay. So the book is split up into 3 sections. Okay. Innocence, influence, and activism. So the first part is the Innocence. It's the Beatles coming to the United States. When they were in New York, they were basically prisoners, right? You know, Plaza Hotel. Then they played their first concert in Washington, D.C., so they got to ride a train in the snow, okay? But when they came to Florida, whole different thing. Beaches, palm trees, tanned, curvaceous young women. This was no contest. And my feeling is this is where the Beatles fell in love with America. This fella, John Trusty, was a sailor down in Key West. I had heard about him. He had encountered the Beatles down there. But what I thought was really interesting was what he said in our interview, the phone interview. You know, we're just getting to know each other, and he goes, he's up in suburban Chicago, and I'm down in Florida, and he goes, where in Florida are you from? I said, I'm from this little bedroom community north of Orlando called Longwood. He goes, oh, Longwood. My sister lives in Longwood. I'm like, wow, what a coincidence. And then he goes, have you ever heard of a street called Needles Trail? And I said, okay, John, yeah, I live on Needles Court. His sister's grandson used to cut my grass. How random is that? But then you start to think about, you know, like some sort of synchronicity or something. So that part was really mind-blowing just in and of itself. And then when he told me about hearing the Beatles for the very first time, I knew I had my beginning to the book. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to read a little excerpt from John Trusty hearing the Beatles for the first time and see if it doesn't jog a few memories of your own. Along the darkened outskirts of Homewood, Illinois, a 1957 Buick, the long and rangy gas-guzzling kind with the sleek lines, barreled down the interstate. All alone behind the wheel, a young crew-cut Navy man nursed a healthy beer buzz and was hauling ass. John Trusty was in transit, having just finished hospital corpsman school in San Diego. In the midst of 30 days home leave near the Windy City, Trusty was preparing to head south to Florida in his assignment at the Naval Air Station Hospital in Key West. To pass the time, to stay awake and keep his brother-in-law's car from ending up in a snowy ditch, he switched on the radio to 89 WLSAM, the bright sound of Chicago radio. And in the wee hours of this frigid night, an urgent, unfamiliar beat hit him like a blast of wind. Oh yeah, tell you something. I think you'll understand. I'm not going to sing it. You guys will all get up and leave if I do that. Oh yeah, that's all you're getting. The music blasting from Trusty's car radio this frigid night was akin to an awakening. During the saddest of holiday seasons post-JFK, dear God, could we say it was joyous? Hearing I Want to Hold Your Hand for the first time on that deserted, snow-blown stretch of interstate, John Trusty picked up on the vibe immediately. And then, admittedly, he did something stupid. I actually started doing donuts on the 4-lane highway. I was so happy, he marveled. I don't know. I can't say why. I heard it and just, wow, this shit is good. In this dream flight of time and imagination, we're witnessing a youth's visceral reaction to music of his generation. And watching from a drone's eye above, 2 tons of American steel on 4 wheels swirl round and round, just like an old school 45 RPM single on a kid's portable record player. At a pivotal moment in time, musically, culturally, and politically, America's youth were meeting the Beatles, their new North Stars, one DJ, one radio, one record player at a time. Does that jog any memories for y'all? Next slide, please. You can't tell this story without including the African American experience because it was so profound with the Beatles experience in the Sunshine State. And this lady, Kitty Oliver, actually saw the Beatles at the Gator Bowl in Jacksonville. And that was a big deal. And we'll talk about that, why, in just a minute. Anything unusual about this picture, to y'all? You know who's there, right? You know who that is. That's Little Richard, okay? They're opening for him in Europe in, that looks like it's probably 63, 62 or 63. In fact, that's where they met the young 15-year-old keyboardist, Billy Preston, who's on this tour. But what strikes you as unusual about it? Come on, come on. Yeah, they're hugging. Not us. We look at it, yeah, so what? But back then, that was a big deal, you know, and that they were touching someone of color. But to the Beatles, that just didn't really seem like a big deal at all. They always played with musicians of color. And when they came to the United States for their first proper tour, they did the same thing. Next slide. So as we're finding out that the Beatles are coming to America to play the Ed Sullivan Show, this poor guy, Sergeant Buddy Dresner with the Miami Beach Police Department, is working nights. And so he sleeps days. And he gets this urgent banging on the door to wake him up one morning. And it's another one of the police officers. And like, Captain Smith needs to see you up at headquarters right now. And So this poor guy is groggy and he doesn't know what the hell's going on, but he shambles up to the police department and the captain says, "You are going to be the security guard for the Beatles." And he's like, "What the hell is Beatles?" He had no clue. But Buddy might as well have been right out of central casting. He becomes just a critical part of the first section of the book. And as you take a look, you can see how good of friends they became with him. Look at Paul. Is that Paul? Oh, Paul, you cheeky devil. He's got his revolver and he's pointing it at him. You know, that would not fly so well today. But Buddy was great. And I was lucky enough, we talk about sources, and I want to describe the building blocks of the book for you. Now, Buddy had passed away in the early 2000s, but his son Barry has lovingly put all of the memorabilia together that his dad gathered, was able to get when he was the Beatles bodyguard. In fact, you can look at it at a website, buddyandthebeatles.com. And it's wonderful because Barry did like about a 3-hour oral history with his dad back in probably, I don't know, late 80s, early 90s. And so because of that, I've got, Buddy's first person memories of all of these wonderful experiences that he had with the Beatles to draw on. And he did yeoman's work for $3 an hour, guarding what was becoming the world's most famous band. Next, please. This was amazing. I'm going to tell you, as a history geek and as somebody who really, loves the thrill of the chase, the thrill of the pursuit, the Life magazine team were the ones responsible for that iconic Life magazine image, where they're floating in the pool. This actually took place at a family's home on Biscayne Bay. And this lady right here, I'm going to step out of the frame for just a minute. That's her right there. That's Gail Cameron. She's got a good reason to be smiling, thinking, "My God, I finally got him in the pool." She was assigned to cover them in New York City and got caught up in the stuff at JFK and the swarming crowds to the point where one of the policemen lifts her up out of her shoes, thrusts her into a limousine, and that's where she meets Ringo Starr. And she goes, my shoes. He lifted me right out of my shoes. And ever the gentleman, Ringo goes, "We'll get the shoes, love." So that was Gail's first memory of seeing the Beatles. But as her very prescient editors realized, the Beatles were a phenomenon. They were a cultural phenomenon. So they said, "Hey, Gail, here's an idea. Why don't you get on the plane with them to Miami and let's take a picture of them in a pool, right?" And she's like, "Oh my God, okay, whatever." And all of these other folks, I was lucky to interview him, the guy who actually took the iconic picture, John Loengard, all 5 members of the team, and that was an absolute treat because these guys also, photographed Muhammad Ali, Medgar Evers. Gail was a very close friend of Jackie Kennedy's and was with her in Hyannis when the election reports of 1960 came back, where Jackie's husband was elected president. And she said, it was just she and I hanging out. It wasn't like there were, all these live trucks and satellite trucks and reporters everywhere. So she had an intimate knowledge of Camelot. And then, of course, the assassination. And she said, we just went through the next few weeks just numb. We just couldn't believe it. And she was the one who said, then you had these Beatles come on the scene, and it was like we had permission to smile again. That was so interesting because if anybody would know, it would be her. And so, she comes down here and she said if she's riding along in the limo from the Miami airport to the Deauville Hotel where the Beatles stayed, she said she had this moment of clarity, just like, my God, it doesn't get any better than this. And then she realized, oh God, I still got to find a pool for them to get into. I still have to get them to agree to do it. Well, I think it's just because she was in a pool, she was by the pool. And this is the state of relief she's in, because look, the guys are in the pool. And by the way, it was not heated, and it was February. But as I've said, for that kind of exposure, that kind of circulation of Life magazine, Brian Epstein would have had them get into a pool of molten lava. But so Gail talks about trying to convince John Lennon to do it, because this was after they'd appeared on Sullivan the second time in Miami Beach. And she's up on the 12th floor of the Deauville, talking to the guys, talking to the leader, John. And then finally he relents, and she says it in his voice, okay, love, we'll do it. I love how okay, love. But this was a real treat to talk to all of the 5 people who were responsible for this iconic image, and the family that was involved here. There was they have a very interesting story, and I will tell you, as a little tease to the book, the Beatles were not the most famous people who had passed through their backyard. So that was interesting, and just a wonderful slice of life. Next, please. Okay, so we're going to talk about a little more of that weird synchronicity stuff. On the right, well, in the middle there, the little guys are Ed Sullivan's grandsons. And I interviewed the kid on the right, Rob Precht. And he had some amazing memories of being there at the Deauville during the sound check. He goes, that music is absolutely burned into my soul. I remember it so well. And I believe him, but he said they were so nervous about the show coming off successfully, given the fact that this was a working beach resort that they did the Ed Sullivan remote from. Lots of pressure. It was maxing out the power grid. And Sullivan's family actually went down and stayed at a different hotel just because they were so nervous. They were scared it wasn't going to come off okay, but it did. Anybody recognize the lady here on the left? No? Well, so I told you about being in the Hard Rock collection, right? In that nondescript building that looked like an insurance office. And the guy who is the archivist for all this stuff had this online program called Memorabilia Monday. So he and I are talking about my research, and he's showing me this amazing stuff, Beatle letters, signed artwork, all kinds of cool stuff. And this lady calls me up. And she goes, I saw you on Facebook talking about the Beatles. And I just want you to know that I was Buddy Dresner's next door neighbor. And the reason she knew me to call me, that's the judge from the Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman trial. That's Judge Deborah Nelson. And I'm like, well, I'm blown away. I'm like, Your Honor, this is amazing. She goes, oh, call me Debbie. I'm like, okay, Debbie. She proceeds to talk herself into a chapter I've already written about the Beatles visiting the Dresner home for the first time to have their first home-cooked meal in America with this cop's family. So she's, she had figured it out. She said, yeah, I was over at the Dresner's house one day. The phone rings. It was Paul McCartney. And they swear her to secrecy. She's like 11 years old and precocious, and she wants to be there for every second. And they said, if you get a big crowd of people around the house, the Beatles, they're all just going to drive by and they're not going to stop. So she described being across the street, looking through the picture window, seeing the limo pull up. Here comes the Fab Four to this. I mean, it's just a typical little cinder block Florida house. But that's where the Beatles had their first home-cooked meal in America. And finally, she gets the gumption to go up and knock on the door. So she's invited in to eat dessert with them. And that's where she got that card that she still has today, signed by all the Beatles. But again, synchronicity. It's like, what the hell? I covered that trial, and I was scared to death of her. And she was just as not calling me Debbie. So yeah, me and Debbie are tight now. Next. Next slide, please. The Convergence of Icons. So after The Beatles have been on Sullivan. They decide that they like it so much in Florida, they're going to stay another week. Unbeknownst to Buddy Dresner, who gets the news, and most people would be thrilled to be hanging out with the Beatles for another week, but he was like, look, I got a wife and 3 kids at home, and I'm making $3 an hour on overtime. But he was a trooper and he stayed with them. And I'm sure you all are aware of this one on the left, right? When they visited Cassius Clay the week before he beat Sonny Liston to win the world championship. That was also down in Miami. And I interviewed Robert Lipsyte of the New York Times, who was with the Beatles in the locker room waiting for Cassius Clay to show up. And the Beatles are not too happy at all to be waiting for this guy, because they'd only seen what they'd seen of him on TV. And they thought he was kind of a big mouth. And they thought Liston was going to beat the hell out of him. And so Lipsyte's there trying to, cut up with them a little bit, but they're about ready to leave. And then he said, Cassius Clay bursts into the training room, and he said they're all just like, because he's just cut like a Greek god, and look at how much taller he is than them. So they were all mutually impressed. And as Lipsyte has since written in the New York Times, to him, this was the very beginning of the 60s, right here, with this convergence of icons. And I don't know if you all would agree or not, but his story was pretty amazing. He shared it with me as he was hunkered down in Long Island away from everybody, because we were in the throes of the COVID epidemic and pandemic, and that presented a lot of challenges. So after Cassius Clay wins, you recognize that guy on the right in the glasses that's with him? Malcolm X. He was down there. He's another guy. And not long after Cassius Clay then became Muhammad Ali, he joined the Nation of Islam. And all of that is going on in 64, Florida. Next slide, please. Oh, him. That guy. So I thought I would do another reading because of little Tommy Petty, and a little more than a passing connection to Gainesville, right? And he had some wonderful memories of seeing the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, and how many kids go on to not only live their dream but become a bandmate with one of the Beatles. Traveling Wilburys, George Harrison. On the surface, there was nothing special at all about little Tommy Petty. Nothing to give the slightest inkling that one day he would become a superstar, and his band's all commercial successes would go on to sell 80 million records. One day, as impossibly far-fetched as it would have sounded, when Petty caught the bug in 8th grade, he would end up being bandmates with a Beatle, George Harrison, aka Nelson Wilbury, in a beloved rock and roll supergroup, the Traveling Wilburys. His journey began just as soon as he saw them on the Ed Sullivan Show. I think the whole world was watching that night, Petty recalled, of their first Sullivan Show appearance. Everything around you was changing. It was like going from black and white to color, really. They just came out and flattened me. It was electrifying. Petty's musical interest changed just that quickly. It changed him from being a solid Elvis fan. Then he got super interested in what was happening with the Beatles, Petty's childhood friend Keith Harbin, remember? Growing up in Jacksonville, Mike Campbell, the teen destined to become Petty's songwriting soulmate, said his lifelong obsession with music didn't come into full flower until he too saw the Beatles via the Sullivan Show. I saw them and I wanted a guitar, he reflected. The Beatles showed up when people were ready for some medicine, some soul medicine. After that, I played the guitar from the time I came home until I went to bed. Though the two would not meet until the end of the decade, the Beatles and Sullivan put Petty and Campbell on a path to convergence and their own indelible impact on rock and roll. A short time after Sullivan, at a teen dance at the American Legion Hall, the Beatles' influence could be seen and heard from the band playing. They were pretty good, Petty said. What knocked me out was their hair. It was already long. The Allman Joys, featuring two brothers from Daytona Beach shores, Dwayne and Greg Allman, started out all dressed in Beatle-inspired collarless jackets. They had picked up on the transformative effect of the Beatles in sound and fashion, integrating both elements into their earliest live shows. Soon there was a competition among local garage bands to see who could best reproduce Beatles songs. And one of the big reasons I brought that up is because Tom saw the young Allman Brothers right here in this building. And you were there, weren't you, Keith? You were there too. Say, they are so cool. They ought to be up here giving the speech, not me. But yeah, that's just an amazing thing to think of that. And one thing I wrote about in my Graham Parsons book was how Central and North Florida especially had what I called the youth center circuit. And it's because of places like this, where young Tom Petty or young Stephen Stills or Dwayne and Greg Allman could play, could tour, could be on stage, if you will. And they got all of that experience. So when, stardom finally came around, they were ready. And hence the Beatles playing in Hamburg and all those horrible shows, playing 5 and 6 hours a night. But when they were ready for stardom on the Ed Sullivan Show, they were tight and they were a band, and there was no fluke about it. Next, please. Please do. Keith Harbin.
He got a brand new color.
He's saying at the time, what perfect timing. This is for the Zoom and all of that. The Pettys had just bought a color TV, so literally it had gone from black and white to color. Mm-hmm.
Frankly, that's not. We had black and white. I mean, that is another phase of things.
Oh yeah, and I think seeing the Beatles in living color, especially for the young ladies in the room, right? That just took Beatlemania to a whole different level, without a doubt. I mean, just a whole different experience. And for the guys who weren't the big athletes like me, the guys who weren't necessarily in the cool crowd, Petty talked about seeing the Beatles as a collective, and the Stones too, and saying, maybe I don't have to look like Elvis. Maybe we can be stars. And, with Buddy Holly and the Crickets, they wrote their own songs too. So this idea of a collective and no exact star with the Beatles was very inspiring, I think, to people like Tom. And you notice the Beatle wig on the right. Oh, and Tom's got his Beatle boots on too. Very cool. But there's a serious aspect to Tom wearing the wig like that. Let's go to the next slide if we can. As we go on in years, this is probably 69, 70, wouldn't you guys say? And 71. Oh, and some group named Leonard Skynyrd opening up for them, huh? Back there in the back is Tom Leadon, and I was lucky enough to interview Tom and, Keith and Kathy and Bernie Leadon and a lot of people who were there. And this was after Tom and company saw the Allman Brothers band at this battle of the bands at Gainesville High School, right? And that was a really illuminating experience because now they weren't the Allman Joys anymore. They weren't playing covers. They were this massive dual lead guitar, heavy band with a recording contract, and they were playing their own songs. And, Tom and all those guys, they're still kind of knocking around playing Beatles covers, and it occurs to them that they need to start writing their own material. But at this same time, you look at Tom, probably not looking as great as he did in later years once he was successful. And after interviewing Tom Leadon for a long time, and we were corresponding, and he remembered one night just out of the blue that absolutely blew my mind. He goes, Tom and his dad had really been clashing because, Tom's working as like a grave digger and a landscaper and all this different stuff. He's dropped out of school, right, at St. Pete College down there, and things boiled over. And Tom said that young Tom Petty came to his house and said, my father just chased me out of the house at gunpoint. And it just goes to show you, what it took to stay dedicated to this dream that probably didn't look like it was going too far there in that ramshackle house at Mudcrutch Farm. But it just underscores Tom Petty's belief that one day he would make it. And I found that story from Tom Leadon very compelling. And again, if you do this kind of stuff, especially when I tell students, listen, attentively, really listen with great intent. Don't be always trying to come up with the next question, because a lot of times this really interesting stuff they'll tell you is just kind of a throw-in. Oh, and there was this. Or John Trusty saying, yeah, I started doing donuts in the middle of the highway. I'm like, okay, whoa, what? That can be the best, stuff that ends up in the book. So next, please. So this is where, the last section where we're talking about Tom Petty, talking about the Leadon brothers, of course, Bernie and Don Felder ended up in the Eagles. You had the Leonard Skynyrd guys, who, Ronnie Van Zant saw the Stones in Jacksonville in '65, like just days after Keith had written Satisfaction. So, the Beatles started this amazing wave of influence among a fraternity of musicians here in Gainesville especially. And then if you go as the crow flies 50 to 100 miles to Jacksonville, you start counting the number of musicians now in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame who were inspired by the Beatles. That is pretty inspiring. So now we go to the activism part. And once they'd come for Sullivan, they'd had the huge success. In April of '64, what happens on the Billboard chart? All 5 top spots are Beatles songs. And they're just exploding everywhere. In the book, I talk about all these different sales figures, and they were amazing. And it was time to do their first proper tour. And Brian Epstein is getting these remarkable offers to do all these different places. And it was, I would say, very likely him that put a clause in their rider. Now, if you don't know what riders are, it's just basically, the artist demands at every tour stop. Like Van Halen wanted no brown M&Ms back in the green room, But this demand was a little more important. Clause number 6, artists will not be required to play in front of segregated audiences. And that was quite a stand. And I was lucky enough to spend hours and hours with that guy on the right, Larry Kane, who, when the Beatles first came to Miami, was a 21-year-old radio newsman who was not thrilled at all to be having to cover some pop band. But by the end of it, he realized what a big story this was. So when they announced that they were coming to Jacksonville to play the Gator Bowl, he sends a letter to Brian Epstein saying, hey, I'd like to interview those guys at the Gator Bowl. And Brian says, oh, we'd love to have you join us on the entire North American tour. And the first time Larry meets John Lennon in San Francisco, John has this very interesting sense of humor. John says to Larry, and I'm going to use a better word than the word John used, why are you dressed like a sissy, man? And Larry was kind of taken aback, and because he was called the F word by John. And instead, Larry gathers himself and asks John about the buildup in South Vietnam. And, John was more than happy to give him an answer, because these guys' worldview was already developing by leaps and bounds as they're coming back to America. And this is Larry on the North American tour with the Beatles. He's the one who asked them about Jacksonville and said, there's a likelihood that show in Jacksonville is going to be segregated. And this is Paul responding to him. This is Las Vegas, and Paul says, we don't get it. You know, we don't get it. And again, remember we saw the picture of them with little Richard. No big deal. But he says, you know, we don't get why, in the South especially, colored people, which was an acceptable term back then, he's where he said they're treated like animals in some places. This is Paul, who everybody assumes is the winking happy guy, you know? And he goes, I wouldn't care if one of them sat next to me. And they all said, if the Gator Bowl was segregated, we will not play there. And that was really taking a risk, considering, yeah, they were very famous and selling a lot, but they could have gone straight downhill too. They stood behind their convictions, and as it turned out, the Gator Bowl was desegregated, so that standoff never happened, fortunately. But they were very lucky to have someone as incisive as Larry Kane on the tour with them. And in fact, as Larry's done interviewing all of them, he's walking down the hall when he gets this tap on the shoulder, and it's John Lennon. He's like, hey man, I'm sorry about the clothes bullshit. I look forward to more stuff with you. So it's like it was some kind of test, you know? And Larry and John stayed friends after the Beatles broke up. And Larry ended up being this big television anchorman in Philadelphia. Any of you recognize Larry? Or, I mean, he's written books about his travels with the Beatles and all of that. But when John was promoting Walls and Bridges in '74, he actually came on Larry's broadcast and did the weather. So I guess he was dressed okay then. Next, please. So I want to just point out a couple other people I was lucky enough to interview. Again, I'm just going to walk out of frame for a second. This is Reggie Young of the legendary Memphis Boys, who was in the Bill Black combo. And this is Lillian Walker Moss of the Exciters. So I was lucky enough to interview the two of them. This is Ivor Davis. He's written a couple of great books. I quoted from him too. He had some very interesting things to say. But you look at that tour from '64, and you can see, you know, there's a lot of black and white, and for the Beatles that was okay. It was just normal to them, and to have the insight from both of those musicians who were on the tour, like for instance, one of them, I can't remember if it was Ringo or George, talked about the fact that they liked Jelly Bellies, you know, the soft little candy. Well, the American girls thought they meant jelly beans. And it was like, they'd be ripping them at the opening acts or the Beatles and things like that. And, you know, Ivor Davis is saying, you know, it's coming down on Ringo's drum set like hailstones and all of that. And Reggie Young said that, you know, the girls would get upset that we're trying to do our warm-up act and start pelting us with that. But he also said the musicians on tour supported the Beatles' stand to be against segregated audiences. Next slide, please. And so as we move towards the Beatles concert in Jacksonville, the St. Augustine struggle is in, you know, full force. And there's, you know, all kinds of nonviolent demonstrations going on. And if you remember, Luther King in June of '64 got arrested at the Monson Motor Lodge in St. Augustine. But then it just kind of goes gray as to what happened to him after that. Well, he appeared before a grand jury as a friendly witness there. And then the judge decided for safekeeping, they would transport him from St. Augustine, where this is. That's Andrew Young in the window, by the way. And they're going to take him to Duval County to be held there just for safekeeping, for his own safety. So what do? They put that police dog in the back seat with him to make the ride all the way to Jacksonville. And you look at the dog looks as bewildered as he does. You know, he doesn't look like he's ferocious or anything, but it's just a really odd picture. But I was fortunate enough to get a transcript of the testimony that Dr. King gave in Jacksonville to a very important federal judge by the name of Brian Simpson, who made some crucial rulings that helped start the dominoes falling for the Civil Rights Act of July of 64. And because of that, once people started sort of ignoring that piece of legislation that said you could not segregate public places, people started being hauled in front of the judge there in Jacksonville. And he said, look, I'm going to fine you and throw you in jail if you don't follow this act. It's the law of the land. That's why there wasn't an issue when the Beatles played the Gator Bowl in September of 64. Next, please. So this concert is coming up in Jacksonville. Okay, so segregation is not an issue anymore, but guess what is? September 64, Jacksonville. Bingo. You what? Oh, you read the book. God bless you. No, you're good. So yeah, all the times the townspeople in Jacksonville, yeah, hurricane's coming. You always had the current that would take it north. So nobody expected that finally something would come, but sure enough, this thing is a Category 3 and it's headed right for downtown Jacksonville. So the Beatles have got to figure out somewhere else to go. They played a concert in Montreal, and they can't go to Jacksonville. So it's Larry Kane who suggests, hey, let's go down to Key West. So that's where the Beatles diverted. Here they are in the middle of the night on September 9th of 64. And over on the right is where the Beatles stayed at the Key Wester. And I do want to mention one thing, because I'm a historic preservation guy. The only building left in Florida where we can say the Beatles slept here is this one. Right there. That was their little cabana at the Key Wester. And a lot of really interesting things happened, especially between Paul and John, just as the heaviness of this tour kept going on. And some wonderful stories from there. Next slide, please. One of my favorite stories was interviewing the guy on the right, Lofton Coffee Felder. When they found out the Beatles were out at the Key Wester, he told me, his manager, Herb Rosenberg, called up there, and he said, I got a black Beatle I want you all to meet. And so he finishes his regular gig, goes out to the Key Wester and jams with the Beatles out there. And he remembered the first song was Blueberry Hill, for sure, but he couldn't remember the second one. And then it was 4 o'clock in the morning and the cops finally broke up the jam session out there, but it's a great story for him. And again, during the COVID epidemic, okay, I'm wearing one of those ZQ95, whatever the hell masks they were, because I sure as hell was not going to infect a Key West treasure like Coffee Butler. You've also got John here. He went shopping on Duval Street to get some civilian clothes because he was going to be part of a photo spread for Cosmo magazine, which happened in Key West. And a young, enterprising reporter by the name of Gloria Steinem was writing a story about the fact that they kind of figured John was the Beatle that might have a little staying power once this, Beatle thing flames out, So it's kind of funny. The article didn't even come out until late in the year. But yeah, John's the one that looks like he might actually be a star at the end of all this. So the Beatles' time in Key West is very remarkable, even though it was only about 3 days. Next, please. And there you are. The Gator Bowl, September 11th of 64. The only issue was, if you look at their hair blowing, and they still had tropical storm force winds after the hurricane came through, but all of the electrical was buried and they still had electricity, so the show could go on. But poor little Tommy Petty, Earl and Kitty Petty, decided that the weather was too bad for him to make the trip, so he missed out on seeing the Beatles, unlike you guys. But it all turned out well. They played their show. There wasn't any issue with segregation or the Klan or any of that. And Kitty Oliver, the young woman I showed you at the beginning, went there all by herself. And she said for her, Jacksonville still was kind of like apartheid. There were parts of West Jacksonville where you were expected to stay. And the Gator Bowl was what she called in a zone of uncertainty. And yet, she loved him so much, she came to see the Beatles by herself. And she talked about, sitting among the crowd just like anybody else, just kind of trying to scrunch in there. And she screamed with the rest of them. And as she's leaving the show, an African American brother and sister meet up with her, and they're like, "You came here alone?" But, to her, it was just something she was going to do. So, the Beatles, progressiveness, their sense of racial social justice prevailed. And as a result, they integrated the Gator Bowl for concerts. I will say that sporting events had been integrated long before that. Next slide, please. Okay. So I wanted to figure out a way to wrap up the book. And I was lucky enough to see both living Beatles in concert recently. And this is at Camping World Stadium last, I think it was May. And it was hotter than hell outside. But I'm standing with a group of diehard Beatles fans waiting for this moment to happen. This is another video clip. If you could play this clip. And this will have a little sound to it. Oh, perfect. What a dork. Good day, sunshine. I don't know. What do you say to one of the most famous guys in the world in 3 seconds? Next slide, please. The important part was I had been standing there in the burning heat with these diehard fans, including this young lady who you can't hardly see it, but she's got an entire sleeve of tats on her left arm that's all Beatles inspired stuff. And this little girl who had come all the way from Mexico with her dad, skipped her senior prom to see Paul McCartney. And the tears are going down her face. And I'm like, God, I've got a daughter your age. And I started getting choked up. But the moral of the story is that 60 years on, Beatlemania still burns as bright as it ever did. Wouldn't you all agree? Thank you all very much. Thank you. Now, we obviously have some people in this room with stories that I'm sure are cooler than mine. I've already heard a few of them. But if you had any questions or comments, I'd be glad to entertain them. There's some books back there. I'd be happy to sign one for you as well. What I will do is if you have a question or a memory or whatever, just so they can hear us online as well, I'll be repeating it, if you don't mind. Questions or comments? Usually takes about 10 to 12 seconds before somebody, yes. Wow. No. Well, I got a story I got to share from Larry Kane. Okay, this is Larry, Mr. Reporter guy. He goes, he first shows at the Cow Palace on the 64 tour, and he thinks, I'm going to go in the crowd and see what it's like to experience the Beatles along with these lovely teenage girls. And what happens? He proceeds to get trampled. And he said there was like a mass unit for all of the people injured. And, the Beatlemania could be more than a little dangerous. But sorry I didn't see the show. It was still a pretty cool story. Questions, comments? Yes, sir. Boy. Hooligans. Was that after you disowned him already? He said, yeah, thanks, Dan. You know, it's funny, you guys keep bringing up interesting memories, and I wanted to tell you that after Larry Kane was invited to cover the entire North American tour, he goes to his parents, and his old man is just like yours. Like, no, that's bad news. You need to stay hell away from them. But Larry's mom, who was terminally afflicted with MS, says, no, you need to go. This could change your career. This could change your life. And based on that advice, he went, and she was absolutely right. Another comment? Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, that is amazing. But you know, finally, by 66, they were getting the sound right, you know, so you could finally hear them. You couldn't hear it, huh? Oh, isn't that funny? But you still get to say, I saw him. Didn't hear him, but I saw him. Any other questions or comments? Yes, sir, please.
Miami Beach Senior High School.
Miami Beach Senior High.
Wait from Hillville Hotel.
Live close to the Deauville.
Places mom.
Right.
No way to get through that. See the Beatles.
Sure.
Sit down for the beach stop. Back up the stairs, up to the pool area. And I'm just sort of sauntering up to the back door of the hotel. I'm stopped by the pool beach.
Pool manager stopped you.
Hey, what are you doing here? Well, I want to challenge. Forget it.
Ah, did you all hear that? He pretended to be a pool boy at the Deauville.
I got the challenge.
He got the job. Quit the same day. No.
The treatment you go to the beach area. You let me go through the front of the hotel.
To the lobby.
My friends on the back of the pool. Just at that moment, the Fab Four were coming into the sort of service area and going up the service elevator. And so I got my little moment to screen that.
You saw them. Very cool. You know, it reminds me, there was a memo from the police captain saying, we want to take them in the back where we took President Kennedy in 62. And I did have the good luck to interview a baggage guy for National Airlines who's retired and lives in Volusia County. And he said they were waiting to load the baggage on the Beatles plane, and they're at this kind of off blockhouse type site. And a security guard kind of looks in, and it's just him and his coworker. So disappears. In come the Beatles. And they all sit down. So it's these two guys, and it's the Beatles sitting over here. And Paul is just snap, 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 taking all kinds of pictures. And the guy finally goes up to him and said, what the hell are you taking pictures of a dirty window for? And Paul says, I just want to get all of this down in case this bubble bursts tomorrow. That's in the book too. Any more questions or comments? What a nice full house we have today. Yes. You were at the Gator Bowl. Wow. Okay. Sure. Mm-hmm. 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 Jeez. Did you get the little plastic binoculars too? No, okay, that was another package. All right. Kathy. Yes, you did. But she was nice. She was nice enough to lend me her diary, so I could. Yeah, exactly. You know.
Swimming with the black girl.
It was Ringo. Ron Trusty tells that story in the book. Yeah. So yeah, you're right on the money there. Yes, indeed. All right. Yes, ma'am. How are you? Didn't see you back there. Yeah. What about the Deauville? Huh. Judge Michael Hansman. I'm not going to mention any names. Michael Hansman. You decided, after the tragedy at Champlain Towers, where they had that terrible collapse and loss of life, that he didn't want to risk that with the Deauville, even though it wasn't occupied. You had the owners who had tied up the issue in court after a hurricane hit the Deauville and closed it in 2017. And we lobbied hard. I was even quoted in the New York Times. I mean, they took it that seriously to save what I think is one of the three most important Beatle landmarks in North America. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, how could it not be? A year ago, it was imploded. And now it's a nice vacant lot. So maybe they'll put parking there or something. But the memories remain. And I'm glad they're captured in this book because people were so kind to share their stories. But yeah, the Deauville is no more. And that's why I'm hoping that one place I told you about in Key West, maybe we could turn that into a Florida heritage site because they spent some important time there. But yeah, it's a shame that now they said they're going to rebuild it somehow, but once you level it like that, I would argue all the memories are gone to a degree. It's not like the American Legion Hall where you saw the Allman Brothers with Tom Petty, right, Keith? That's why this is wonderful. And this exhibit, I was here for the opening, and the Sundowners played here. I call them the vibrations of history. I really do. And I feel them when I'm in a place like this, truly. So if that's everything, again, the books are in back. I'll be glad to hang out and sign one if you like. Otherwise, thank you all so much. Thank you. Thank you.